His parish is the whole world. Biography of Father Stefano Gobbi, founder of the Marian movement of priests, written by Maria delle Tavazzi. Chapter 1. His Early Years. If men only knew what eternity was, they would do everything possible to change their lives. A quote from Sister Jacinta of Fatima. Childhood. Stefano Gobbi was born in the town of Dongo, in the province of Como, in northern Italy, on Saturday, March 22, 1930. Born at the same time was his twin brother Giuseppe. Their parents, Gaspare and Maria, already had 3 children, and one more was still to come, making a total of 6 in their little family nest. Dongo is located at the mouth of the small Albano River, on the western shore of Lake Como. Majestic Mount Legnone rises nearby, offering to the inhabitants of Lake Como's scattered, bordering communities a sense of protection by its massive crags. This town was the first stop on an ancient road, which, via the San Giorgio Pass, wound around connecting the different little towns along Como's shores, and ending at Val Mesolicina at the foot of the Grigione mountain range. This ancient road was a part of the history of the Como lakeshore towns because it was used not only by merchants traveling to Germany, but also by outlaws. These were usually young men who would use the road as an easy escape route, thinking they were big shots if, after smuggling their goods, they managed to cross the nearby river and reach the other shore without getting caught by the police. The origins of Dongo are lost in history. It is thought that its inhabitants were descendants of an Etruscan colony who settled on the shores of the lake about the middle of the 2nd century before Christ, maybe about 150 BC. It seems that the name Dongo derives from its topographic position. It is formed by a curved depression along the shore. Ancient historians called it Uncum and also Anduncum, which means curved. Abbreviated, it was called Duncum or Dungum, and thus it came to be called by its modern name of Dongo. In recent times, Dongo became a famous town in Italy because it was here that Benito Mussolini was captured with other fascists on April 28, 1945. The Deuce, as Mussolini was called, was arrested the day before on the lakefront. He was taken to the town hall of Dongo, and then, for greater security, was forced to go to the police station in nearby Germasino. To this day, there are some elderly locals who still remember seeing Mussolini appear at the window that overlooked the main thoroughfare of the town. It was from this place that he wrote a final letter to all the Italian people before being shot to death. On that day, however, a young 15-year-old Stefano Gobbi was not living in Dongo. He was rather at a boarding school of the Franciscan friars in the province of Brescia. Nevertheless, he was affected by the events which had put his small town in the national spotlight. It seems that around this time, Dongo became well known and famous for another reason, when it became associated with a new elusive name, Dongo gold. It was said that enormous monetary reserves of gold had been hidden there, brought by the fascists to somewhere, supposedly in Dongo. This was before their capture by the anti-fascist partisans. For years and years, the famous treasure was sought after, but never found. Dongo was therefore the scene of war and death and of hidden treasures. Could this possibly be why divine providence let Stefano Gobbi be born there? That in contrast he might be made the humble servant of the Most Blessed Virgin Mary and spread her messages throughout the world. It seems that on one occasion the Virgin Mary clarified for him his special role with the following words: "All of you must become instruments which I will make use of for the healing of all poor sinners. I ask of you to remain always in my peace, to become instruments of peace for all." That was a message of August 15th, 1984, from the Blue Book. The people of Dongo, inhabitants of a border town, were among individuals being accustomed to sacrifices and battles. This is how Stefano's character was formed. He was combative, bold, direct, and harsh at times. He was stubborn, but also capable of humbly asking forgiveness. The people of Dongo are like this. They can be compared to the rugged rock of the mountains which contain springs of fresh water, deeply satisfying man's thirst. They are also like the great Lake Como, whose waters are pleasing to the eye, but also create unexpected and dangerous whirlpools. That's the way Stefano Gobbi was, like the rock and like the lake, with a strong character, with words that gently enlighten, but which can also be violently upsetting. This saying is true. It is our native land that shapes us. On March 30th, 1930, when Stefano was 8 days old, his parents brought him and his twin brother Giuseppe to the parish priest of Dongo, Father Prospero Bellissini, who baptized them. Their baptisms, however, took place at the parish of Santa Marina in Martinico, in a small locality a short distance away, because the parish church of Dongo was in disuse. And, as was customary in those days, Stefano was named after his grandfather, and also after Saint Stephen, the patron saint of the locality. 5 years before, the Gobbi family had experienced great suffering when, due to illness or some type of fever, it's not known exactly what kind, they lost a child. It was their second-born, an infant named Stefano, who lived only a few months. It is a fact that in those days different types of strains of flu passed through Italy, and since there were no vaccines against them, the sorrow of death was often experienced. As a result, 5 years later, when the twins were born, the name Stefano was again given to one of them. A short history of Stefano's father, Gaspare, and his mother, Maria, is interesting. On April 2nd, 1912, at the age of 18, Gaspare sailed to America for work. He was to remain there for 10 long years, kindling hopes, like many Italian families, of putting aside a good sum of money in order to start a family and then to afford to live a better, more dignified life. Like so many Italian emigrants of the times, he was willing to travel to a faraway country alone and in the midst of 1,000 difficulties, because in Italy there was little work and much poverty. His love and nostalgia for his homeland was great, and though he would have liked to have returned much sooner, his parents advised him against it because of the terrible war which was ravishing Europe, World War I, from 1915 to 1918. It was not safe to go back. But finally, in 1922, at the rise of the fascist era, Gaspare was able to return, and in 1924 married Maria Benzonelli. She was a nice small-town girl, a year older than him, and they went to live on Via Campiedi, number 6, in Dongo. Gaspare, in character, was a quiet and reserved man, not given to opening up to others, and only with difficulty talking about himself. Yet at the same time he could be very strict. As a result, his children both respected and feared him. With his fatherly authority, he could easily control his lively group of children, making them immediately be quiet when he came home tired from a hard day's work. As soon as his children saw him coming down the road, they would quickly calm down and get in line with whatever they were doing. At the same time, he was a great storyteller, using words to weave marvelous, fantastic accounts of his life in America, without, however, ever telling them exactly what kind of work he was doing there. One of his grandchildren recalls his grandfather proudly telling them, "I used to skin whales," which meant he had at least seen them, since he had worked in a place near the ocean. He had been an emigrant to San Francisco, California, on the west coast of the United States. After returning to Italy, he began to work on his farm. He had cows which gave milk that he would then sell in the neighborhood. He had vineyards too. He would grow Barbera, Muscat, and American grapes to make wine. Like all the families in town, he also had a grotto, a natural wine cellar, carved into the rock. This niche in the rock, located a good distance from their house, was a kind of storage place where not only wine but other foodstuffs could safely be kept during the hot, muggy summers. At this little place of shelter, the family and friends would come for relaxation and refreshment. Many years later, when he was already ordained a priest, Father Stefano once brought his whole family there. At the grotto, it was just like in olden times. His mother prepared wonderful local dishes to eat, and at the end of the meal, he gave her a big kiss and started to sing one of the Italian popular songs, which goes, "All the mothers of the world are beautiful." Dongo, like all the other towns of Italy, was a place where bartering was popular, especially during the war. People would come together in order to trade one's goods and services. This consisted also in trading personal favors or hours of work in order to help each other out. Gaspare, for example, would work for one of his neighbors, who in turn would return the favor, coming to work for him. Together with his wife Maria, Gaspare raised their children devoutly in the Catholic faith. He would take part in all the parish activities and different functions. He did this not just out of a sense of dutiful custom, but because being a good Catholic at that time meant truly practicing the faith. One example of his involvement was that he belonged to the confraternity of the Most Blessed Sacrament, and this must have been a good example for his children. Gaspare absolutely refused to belong to the fascist party, which at that time meant that he would be somewhat marginalized and had to suffer by being looked down upon with a certain suspicion by others. This quiet and reserved man of integrity was one who preferred to give value to his personal freedom of thought, even at the cost of being an outsider. Section: The Shrine of Our Lady of Tears. The Gobbi family regularly went to the Shrine of Our Lady of Tears. It was a special place that was and always remained dear to Stefano. It was here that he used to serve Mass as an altar boy, and this is where his vocation and call to the priesthood began to develop. You can imagine him looking up and being fascinated by Our Lady's face that was tilted slightly to the right, as if she wished to share the intimacy of her love and sorrow with those who approached her. In her arms she held the baby Jesus with his hand raised in blessing. In his homily of December 26, 2004, Father Stefano said, "As I look at her, I see that Our Lady of Tears has become the icon of my whole priestly life. It is because she holds the smiling child in her arms. Jesus is smiling because in the arms of his mother who protects him, while at the same time she sheds tears because she experiences the sufferings of all her children." In the message of September 15, 1975, she said, "If I am your mother, all your pain is mine as well. And so it is that in my heart I truly feel the repercussions of all the bitterness, all the misery and all the great suffering of the world. If I am your mother, I cannot help but to suffer for my children, for all, especially those who are farthest away, who are most in need, and above all for my poor children who are in sin." End quote. Stefano grew up in the shadow of his beloved Marian image. One cannot forget that as a child, on Sundays, young Stefano had to get up at dawn with his family to go to Mass, which began at 7 a.m. During school days, he would often go to this early Mass, which began even before 7 a.m. And then, afterwards, as the sun was dawning, walk with the other children back home to do some small chores, and then prepare to leave for school. At other times, after serving Mass, little Stefano used to go and gather pine nuts from the cones that had fallen down from the tall pine trees. He would then bring them to his mother, who would use them to prepare her famous miascia cake. After dinner, the whole family used to pray the Holy Rosary together in front of the fireplace. Secretly, in her heart, his mother Maria would pray that Our Lady of Tears would call one of her children to become a priest. During the Rosary, Gaspare, as father of the family, would pray the first decade, and then the children would each pray the other decades. But there was a problem. There were only 5 decades, and one of them would have been left out. Mother then had an idea to help. Stefano and Giuseppe, since they were twins, could pray their decade together, and so everybody was able to participate. In fact, Stefano first felt the call to the priesthood as a small child. In his homily at his first Mass in Dongo, he said, "It was here in Dongo, at the feet of Our Dear Lady of Tears, that my vocation was born. When I was a little boy, I would often go to serve Mass, and it was at the foot of her altar that I heard the call to become a priest." End quote. 40 years later, at his anniversary Mass, he said the same thing, quote, "Our Lady of Tears was the bright star of my life. It was here that my vocation started, and she has been with me, helping me in my whole journey right up to this very day." End quote. His mother Maria was a strong and prayerful woman who focused on what was important. She never missed a Sunday Vesper service. She was a hard-working, reserved person. Stefano was always very close to his mother. There was a profound mother-son bond between them, and even in adulthood, she was a constant reference point for him. Mama, Maria Gobbi, lived almost 100 years. In her life, she experienced 2 of the greatest sorrows a mother could go through, the loss of 2 of her children. The first, Stefano, died in infancy, and Gino, the youngest of her children, died in 1978 at the age of 48. The townspeople remember seeing her in her old age walking around different areas of her land with a cane, doing small chores, and they observed that she would often be immersed in silent prayer. There is a particular account about her that took place shortly before her death. She was living at her daughter Lobdia's house, since she was no longer capable of taking care of herself alone. She kept saying that a Franciscan friar had been coming by to visit her. Her family didn't make any comments, thinking that because of her advanced age, she was confusing her imagination with reality. One day, however, her son, Father Stefano, decided to inquire about this a bit more carefully. He bombarded her with questions, asking her who he was, how was he dressed, and if he could have resembled his friar friend who had accompanied him on past visits. But her response was always negative. What an amazing surprise came when he showed her a holy card of Padre Pio, and without hesitation his mother said, "He is the one who comes to visit me." Father Stefano didn't make any more comments. realizing that the saints of God are known to do this kind of thing. This would not be the only time in which St. Pio Pietrelcina would appear in Father Stefano's life, as we shall see later on. The Gobbi family was fond of the name Stefano and had given this name to two of their children. As stated earlier, the first Stefano lived only a few months. In her message of December 26, 1974, Our Lady talked about this, quote, "St. Stephen was truly a little child. What candor illuminated his soul, what purity his unshakable faith in my Son, and what strength his whole person. He conquered everyone with his glance, with the purity of his faith, with the power of his love. After Jesus, he was my first child, whom many times I clasped to my heart. I knew that he had to be the first one to die, after my son Jesus, and with what tenderness did I encourage him, so that he would become stronger and stronger. And when he fell, killed, they brought him to me, and I again clasped him to my heart. Oh, it was, as it were, the same scene as at Calvary. You too, Stefano, are called to be a crown, the crown of my immaculate and sorrowful heart." End quote. The name Stefano or Stephen comes from the Greek word for crown. Stefano had been called to accomplish something great in life, in spite of all those things which might have been considered more faults than virtues, parts of his unlikely personality. For God, these things would be the means for carrying out his plan of mercy. In her message of November 9, 1984, Our Lady confirmed this, quote, "For this I have chosen as my instrument a son from among the weakest and, humanly speaking, least gifted, and I have brought him to every part of the world to show to all that what is to take place is due solely to my personal and extraordinary intervention." End quote. Growing up, Stefano was like any other child of his age, except that he was very lively and not at all quiet. You could say he was even a bit mischievous. He was always ready to play a practical joke, especially accompanied by his twin brother, and the ones who suffered most from their tricks were their older sisters, Giovanna and Lodia. Once his oldest sister, Giovanna, decided to make apple fritters for the family for dinner, but she couldn't serve the dish because the twins, Stefano and Pino, seeing them on a tray that afternoon, decided to help themselves and started eating them, not just a few, but every one of them. Not only that, but then Stefano had the nerve to blame the others, which cost him the just reward of getting hit over the head with a frying pan by his exasperated sister. The Gobbi children used to go with their father to Baldrigo, just outside of Dongo, to take their cows to pasture. Nearby there was a small cabin which they owned. During their leisure time, little Stefano used to dress up as a priest and used whatever old clothes and coats he could find, and had fun saying Mass. He would prepare the altar, do processions, and even would involve the other children. So far, no harm done. The problem was that he presided over funerals too, which upset one of the neighbors because, according to her, this game brought bad luck. But the more she complained, the more the funerals multiplied. An old childhood friend recalls that on the way back home from school, when the children passed by the farmers' vegetable gardens, they used to steal their strawberries. Quote, "As soon as one of them would get started, the rest of them would follow suit." End quote. And of course, the same boy who used to say Mass was one of the ones who would jump over the ditch and run to visit the strawberry patch. The children used to play jump rope, shoot marbles, play soccer with a ball made out of rags, and it never failed that right in the middle of the fun, a mother or father would show up and go after them with a celestia, that is, a large stick which the farmers used to drive out the cows. This was because there was lots of work to do, the childhood friend explained. We had to keep watch on the cows and bring in the hay, and we had to peel the potatoes. Our parents used to say that the hands of men were no different from the hands of women. And then, after dinner, it was straight to bed. This was how life in the country used to be in those days. Stefano didn't lose his playful and perhaps a bit mischievous character even when he grew up. Several times his resemblance to his twin brother Giuseppe became the cause of practical jokes for the poor and fortunate ones who were made fun of due to the mistaken identity. Once his brother Giuseppe was in the hospital, and Stefano went to visit him. As soon as the nurse saw him, she scolded him, telling him it was time to do physical therapy and not to roam the hallways. Then there was a time that Giuseppe's girlfriend got on a bus and saw what looked like her boyfriend at the back of the bus with other young people. She was surprised that he didn't say hello or even acknowledge her. That evening she reproached him. "If you think you can get close to me only when we're alone, well, you're certainly mistaken." Obviously, it was Stefano sitting in the back of the bus and not Giuseppe. But even Giuseppe played his part. Once he went to visit his twin brother at his workplace in Milan, and he realized that everyone greeted him with respect. "Good morning, Mr. Gobbi." So he decided to let them continue, pretending he was head of that department. The friendship between the two brothers grew stronger over time. When Father Stefano founded the Marian movement of priests many years later, Giuseppe immediately joined as a layperson, taking part in the cenacles with enthusiasm. Section Farewell to Dongo. Stefano was confirmed on May 1st, 1938, by the Bishop of Como, the Most Reverend Alessandro Macci, who lived from 1878 to 1947. From then onwards, he became more aware of his Christian life, and also, without a doubt, of a faint spiritual voice which interiorly urged him to become a priest. He liked being an altar boy at Our Lady of Tears, and it seemed that Our Lady herself was calling him to a lifelong commitment to service in the church. Before Stefano finished elementary school, the Gobbi family started thinking that he should continue his studies with the friars minor. At that time, it was common for children to enter the religious life at an early age. His new school would not only serve as a preparatory school, but also as a place to evaluate a possible religious vocation. The religious environment was a strong incentive, a guarantee for families wishing to foster possible vocations in their children. Little Stefano was very happy with the choice of school, even though he was aware that the separation from his family would be painful. And so, in 1941, as World War II was underway, Stefano entered the boarding school of the Friars Minor in Rodengo Saiano, a small town in the faraway province of Brescia, where the Franciscans ran a boarding school. Why the Friars Minor? We don't know. Perhaps that minor seminary in Como wasn't considered a safe place due to the war, or maybe his parents had a greater regard for the Franciscans than for the diocesan priests. Perhaps it was because the Franciscan fathers at the shrine of Our Lady of Tears had recommended to the family their own choice of school for Stefano. The fact remains that at the age of 11, little Stefano left Dongo. He would not return to be with his family ever again. The bond between Stefano and Dongo would always be very strong. At his 40th anniversary Mass of priesthood, Father Stefano said, quote, "I have always tried to overcome my nostalgia for Dongo by coming here every year on December 26th, the feast of St. Stephen. I left at the age of 11, yet the relationship that binds me to this town is the same as that of those who are forced to live far away from their homeland. They are uprooted, kind of like the emigrants who are united to their homelands by deep sentiments, memories, and nostalgia." End quote. In his homily that day, Father Stefano continued, quote, "My memories of Dongo are limited to my childhood. Now the town has changed. Just think that to get to the main provincial road from my house on Campiedi Street, there were perhaps 2 or 3 houses. In between the houses, there was an expanse of meadows and vineyards. The road there was just an old dirt road, and we used to wear clogs to go to school. We wore our good shoes only on Sundays because we weren't allowed to wear them out. I remember that in winter there was a lot of snow, not like today with just a bit of wet snow here and there. The road would become a path made up of the frozen footsteps of all those who had trampled over it. I remember all of us walking in our clogs. It was an enchanting wintry landscape, with the silence broken only by soft clumps of snow falling from the trees, or by some chirping sparrow passing by in search of food. And then, when the thawing sun began to warm things up in the spring, all the fields would be changed, covered with white flowers, and around the bushes primroses and violets would begin to sprout. As their buds opened up, it looked like a large garden of so many flowers and plants. For us children, it was like living in a wonderland, and I remember how we used to breathe in the wonderful nature that surrounded us." End quote. Chapter 2, With the Franciscan Friars. A quotation from Remo Becero Belti. "God's wonderful masterpiece, the most blessed Mary, the creature who after Christ is the end toward which the centuries have been directed, the Virgin looked upon by ancient generations in anticipation of the Redeemer, the woman whom the new generations have called blessed, teaches us that silence is the breath and rhythm of God." End quote. First section, A New World. Stefano was only 11 years old, and for the first time he was going away from home and was about to begin something totally new at the Franciscan friary. There are no witnesses of that day, but how can anyone fail to imagine the child's excitement for something new, mixed with the pain of seeing his father go back to Dongo after taking him to this new place and not being any longer with his family, his mother, sisters, and twin brother? And how must he have lived out those first few days with all those other children he didn't know? In their letter of application, his parents had stated that they were delighted with the call of their Stefano. One of the friars, now an elderly man, who as a child entered at the same age, said that during his own first few days of nostalgia, due to the separation from his mother, he had asked Our Lady to become his mother. We can imagine that something similar could have happened to little Stefano. The Seraphic Seminary at Rodengo Sayano was located about 80 kilometers from Dongo, and here our little Stefano attended the junior high school during the years of the Second World War, from 1941 to 1945. Our Lady of Fatima had warned of a great chastisement, a war that would come upon Europe if humanity did not return to God. But this warning was not heeded. Sister Lucia of Fatima thus wrote to the Pope in 1982, quote, "And let us not say that it is God who is punishing us in this way. On the contrary, it is man himself who is preparing his own punishment. In his love for us, God warns us and calls us to the right path while respecting the freedom he has given us. Consequently, man is responsible." End quote. Stefano was perhaps too young to be aware of the war and how they were coming to be aware of the events of the war and how they were coming to a head in Italy. He probably had some notion of them by listening to the news given by the rector of the seminary and by noticing that at meals there was no longer any meat, white bread, and many other items. As a little boy, his main concerns were school and his early formation in the Franciscan way of life. In any case, there was no time to be idle. Everything was organized to the last detail, from wake-up time to periods of study, play, school, and prayer. Stefano was gifted with a good ability to adapt. and it wasn't hard for him to fit in. His easygoing personality helped him. An elderly friar recalled, "Life as a student in those days was very strict. The day was divided between periods of prayer with the whole Franciscan community in the friary and other periods in which the students had to study. There was a fixed schedule for play and for work. The younger students worked in the laundry room and the older ones in the kitchen. We used to go for walks. We all felt like little friars." End quote. During the summer of his first year, the Franciscan superiors decided to move for a short time to another friary of the province, and they chose the one in Dongo. There Stefano felt right at home, and like a tourist guide of the town, during their walks he would describe to the others the beauty of the lake and the places he knew so well. The years of secondary school went by quickly. The boy from Dongo did well, both at school and in the demands of religious life. Discipline was not a burden to him. On the contrary, it molded him. Our Lady was always very close to him in his heart and in his formation. The Franciscans in Zayano had a grotto dedicated to Our Lady of Lourdes, and when the weather was good, on Saturdays, they would all walk in procession, singing and praying, and then celebrate Mass at the grotto. As mentioned above, these were the war years of World War II, with crisis, uncertainty, and bombings. The difficulties regarding the means of communication and transportation made it more difficult to communicate with family, and this was true also for Stefano, who lived so many kilometers away from his family. There were very few contacts between them, especially after 1943. But with all things taken into consideration, they weren't too worried. Stefano focused on his life as a friar, and his parents knew he was safe and happy about his call to serve the Lord among the Franciscans. Section Friar Narciso. In 1946, at about 16 years of age, Stefano was transferred to the Friary of Resato in the provincial district of Brescia to start his novitiate year. At this time, following the referendum of June 2, 1946, Italy began to undergo the transition from a monarchy to a republic. These were more than anything years of reconstruction. The war had now ended. There were ruins of war everywhere. And for several years, the hatred and resentment which had accumulated during the war continued to claim its victims. Many years later, Our Lady would say to Father Stefano, quote, "My adversary is bringing about division on all sides, in families, in religious communities, in the church, in all human society. And so I ask of you to remain always in my peace, to become instruments of peace for all." That was a message October 15, 1984. One's inner peace does not necessarily correspond to a civil peace, but it is necessary in order to serve the Lord Jesus freely. The novitiate is a time of decision and discernment. If a candidate perseveres all the way, and if he is convinced his choice is the right one, then at the end of this period he is called to say yes to the Lord for the first time by making the 3 religious vows. Moreover, during the novitiate there is also a strong external sign in that the candidate begins to wear the habit and is given a new name. And so, at the beginning of his stay in Resato, young Stefano was given a habit, the simple robe of a friar, with a cord for a belt and sandals, and also a new name, Friar Narciso. Elderly friar recalls, "The year of the novitiate was a trial year. You entered the community with friars of all ages, and you went through a very serious schedule. You would wake up at about 4:30, go to novitiate chapel to pray, and then proceed with the whole community singing together to offer the divine office and the Mass. Then the novices had lessons with the Master of Novices on consecrated life. It was their duty to clean their living quarters, situated on a wing of the friary called the Professorio." End quote. In that year, Friar Narciso had applied himself very diligently because he wanted to make his religious profession. He was respectful to his superiors. With regard to his companions, however, perhaps due to his strong personality, he was often sociable, but at other times he was not. He also had some type of minor health problem, but at the end of his novitiate, he received a favorable recommendation, and the young man was ready to make his vows. There followed a retreat in preparation for their vows, at which the novices made final resolutions for a life of perseverance. Then, on September 8, 1947, the feast of the Nativity of Mary, Friar Narciso made his 3 vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. The whole Gobbi family from Dongo was present. They were all proud and festive. Many years later, on the same feast day, September 8, 1989, Our Lady would say to Father Stefano, referring to the priests of the movement, "You are part of my progeny and a strong point of my victorious plan. You form a precious crown of purity, of love, and of humility about the cradle in which I am placed. Allow yourselves to be nourished and formed by me. Allow yourselves to be led by me with docility. Allow yourselves to be signed by me with my motherly seal." End quote. It was always the Blessed Virgin who at the beginning and later on would support the gift of his consecration. In the letter of application for his profession of vows, Father Narciso explicitly expressed his desire to become a priest because he strongly felt this call. Therefore, after his first profession, as was the procedure in the Franciscan program, Father Narciso and the other professed companions who would become priests were transferred for continued studies at the Franciscan school of Santa Maria de Sabioncello in Merate, a town that at that time was in the province of Como, but is now in Lecco. Our student, Friar Narciso, would study in Merate for 3 years, from 1948 to 1951. During these years, as students, Friar Narciso and his confreres were guided, as was the custom in those days, with structured lectures aimed at a rigid and strict academic formation. Each school year, every student was assigned a specific task according to his talent. They had to put together a small journal that would be written and illustrated, touching on various arguments according to each student's particular interest. For example, the student theologian would write about theology. A student who was good in music would write about music, etc. Sabioncello had a special missionary atmosphere because there were many Franciscan missionaries at the time who, when they returned from their trips abroad, talked about their experiences, and they created a joyful enthusiasm among the professed youth. Their journals, containing their papers on theological topics on the one hand, and the missionary dreams of many on the other hand, established a positive, creative, and stimulating atmosphere. While some of the youthful students would discuss among themselves the theoretical positions of Duns Scotus and St. Bonaventure, others would consider going off to distant lands. The crisis in the church would arise in the 1970s, but had not yet come. At that time, friaries were alive and popular. The superiors had a positive opinion of Friar Narciso during this period, which strengthened the young boy's conviction of living the Franciscan consecrated life. He continued in his journey smoothly, working hard, and was successful in his studies and in fraternal life. Having now completed a 2-year cycle of philosophy, Friar Narciso was sent to Busto Arsizio, where the candidates for holy orders began to study theology. Stefano was to remain there for another 3 years, from 1951 to 1954. The friary was well known in the province because Blessed Bernardino de Bustis, a theologian and gifted preacher, and the author of the famous Mariale, had lived there. Note, in this work, the Mariale, he presented vigorously the privilege of Mary's Immaculate Conception, expounding the prerogative of Mary, who as mediatrix in the work of redemption is also co-redemptrix and the dispenser of graces in the present work of sanctification. These years of theology engaged the students in courses of dogmatics, morals, biblical exegesis, canon law, biblical Greek, and so forth. Friar Narciso, for his part, demonstrated a definite capacity in his studies and never experienced any academic problems. Beginning the section, The Approaching Storm. As time went by, the final decision to belong to the order was drawing near. In fact, one couldn't become a priest without first having made his solemn profession. At the age of 22, at the end of his religious formation, Friar Narciso, as expected, expressed to his superiors what seemed to him the logical continuation of his Franciscan life, and he wrote the following letter to the Father Provincial. Very Reverend Father, I come to you with this letter of mine to ask of you a great favor in the joyful hope that you, in your goodness of heart, might grant me that which is the object of my fervent desire. On this coming April 22nd, my profession of temporary vows, made in October 6 years ago, will expire. At the renewal of vows, I would like to ask you ardently, Very Reverend Father, to be able to make my solemn profession. In these 6 years, I have felt more than ever the certainty that this is the path the Lord wishes me to take, and continuing to prolong this state would give me a sad feeling of being out of place. This is because at the end of the second theological year, and so close to the goal, I would feel a big void in my life if I don't make the solemn profession, which would validate my final decision. If I could make it on the Sunday in Albis, that is the first Sunday after Easter, now Divine Mercy Sunday, my studies would not be affected. And besides, Very Reverend Father, I worked very hard in the first trimester so that there wouldn't be any difficulty in this regard. And so, to be able to obtain what I'm asking of you more easily, I would like to try to respond to a preliminary question which I hear you will be asking, my Very Reverend Father. Note, are you worthy of it? Father, perhaps I don't deserve it, it is true, but during these 6 years, I have made every effort to be worthy of it. Thus, to show my good intentions, I propose to you the pleasure to possibly grant it to me as your gift, and certainly this would be a most pleasing and unforgettable act of your provincialship. I look forward to your response, hoping that this request of mine will be granted. I promise to remember you especially in my prayers, and may the most Sacred Heart of Jesus assist you always in your difficult tasks. Sending you my respectful and filial regards, I bow to devoutly kiss your hand. Your most devoted son, Friar Stefano Gobbi. This document is still in the archives. The Provincial did give a positive response, and so on April 27, 1952, Friar Narciso made his solemn profession. Can you guess where? In the shrine of Our Lady of Tears in Dongo. The young man had requested this favor, and it was graciously granted to him. Father Matteo Cabri, the guardian of the friary in Dongo, who had been delegated by the provincial minister, Father Innocenzo Gorlani, received his profession. What a memorable day it was for him. The holy card, made to memorialize this day, has the image of St. Paul and reads, Most Holy Virgin of Tears, into your heart I offer my life to the Lord and invoke your blessing on those who prepared for me this moment of grace. The Gobbi family, together with the whole town of Dongo, were so proud of their son, who had reached this aspired goal, and which now opened the door to the other important step of his religious journey, the priesthood. All the people congratulated his parents. After all, it was a great honor for everyone to have a friar from Dongo. However, the step that was supposed to be the confirmation and continuation of a bright spiritual path turned instead to be the beginning of a dark and dramatic journey. A few months after his solemn profession, young Stefano started to withdraw into himself, becoming gloomy and isolating himself. We have no precise documents, nor a personal diary belonging to Father Stefano. nor later on did he ever want to give details of that period. We will have to accept the testimony of the friars of the time who remember this dark time in the life of their confrere. This strange turmoil was visible outwardly as well, to the point that in the superior's annual report it was written that Friar Narciso began to manifest a less sociable and almost ill-tempered attitude towards his companions, and a certain controversial spirit and lack of docility towards his legitimate superiors. Of course, there can always be periods of crisis in religious life, which can actually be healthy. But in Friar Narciso's case, his relationship with the Franciscan order seemed to fall apart more and more, even more so than that of the priesthood. The only people he confided in were his regular confessor and his spiritual director from Busto Arsizio, who encouraged him to persevere, to take time to examine himself further. As a result, on March 13, 1954, while in a state of crisis, Friar Narciso received his subdiaconate ordination in the Duomo, that is, the Cathedral of Milan, along with some other diocesan seminarians, by Cardinal Ildefonso Schuster. The subdiaconate already meant being admitted to the state of holy orders. It was the first step. And years later, Stefano himself, during his first Mass in his native town, said about this, quote, "I remember March of 1954, a Marian year, when I received the subdiaconate from Cardinal Schuster. On the altar, the image of the Pilgrim Virgin stood out. To my astonished eyes, while contemplating it, it was as if it had been placed there between myself and the altar intentionally as a necessary gateway one had to go through in order to come to participate in the mystery of God." End quote. After receiving the subdiaconate, Friar Narciso was transferred to Milan, to the San Antonio Friary in Via Farini, which at that time was a provincial house. This would be the last stage of his life as a friar. The transfer was probably made to help the young friar take a closer look at his Franciscan vocation, which was definitely unsettled in spite of his being admitted to holy orders. In Milan, however, the situation, rather than getting better, only got worse. Friar Narciso felt caged in and reached such a state of crisis that he made the decision, clear and final, to leave the Franciscan order. Today, the Franciscan fathers speak of a dismissal from the order, granted upon the request of the candidate. It is difficult for us to reconstruct the facts of these events, especially those that were confidential, since there are not many details concerning the reasons why he left. It certainly wasn't an easy step to take, because until a year and a half before, Father Narciso seemed to be determined and motivated. Then something happened between the order and himself, something so serious that it caused him to make the irrevocable decision to leave the seraphic order forever. We know that he wasn't the only one to leave, and we know that the Lombardy province in those years was going through a certain stormy period, but we weren't able to find out anything more. Later on, Father Stefano himself, when questioned on the matter, never wanted to give a complete explanation. Something definitely happened, because he didn't leave on account of a slow decline in enthusiasm, like a plant without water that slowly withers. But all things considered, it was something extraordinary that happened, making him change his mind in spite of his perpetual vows and his subdiaconate ordination. It was a drastic breakup, given that he actually petitioned the Holy See for a dispensation from his vows and a reduction to the lay state. He wasn't a priest, but the subdiaconate at that time was considered to be the lowest degree of holy orders. The response to Friar Narciso's petition was immediate. The Sacred Congregation for Religious acknowledged his petition and granted him an indulto, that is, a laicization, that is, the reduction to the lay state, and a dispensation from his vows. It was September 17, 1954, the feast of the Stigmata of St. Francis. 50 years later, upon recalling these events, Father Stefano said, quote, this was from a homily from his 40th anniversary, "I had already finished all my studies and was ready for my first Mass. An investigation was carried out. Everyone was waiting. And then circumstances, which today are still somewhat mysterious, made sure that I would leave the friars and afterwards the clerical state." End quote. These are the words that should be analyzed in greater depth. He speaks about an investigation, about waiting for something, about a response, and finally about circumstances that were not fully explained. Certainly it was an event permitted by God from which he was able to benefit later on. Father Stefano himself admits to a spiritual purification during that time. Quote, "What a long journey it was to reach the priesthood. However, that slow, painful purification was necessary so that in my life, everything that had to fall to pieces would little by little fall to pieces, and then only the truth would remain standing, a truth which was made pure by suffering." End quote. What truth and what suffering? We don't know, but God permitted this painful passage in order to perfect the instrument he would make use of later on for a great masterpiece, the Marian movement of priests. When things happen, we don't understand them at the time. Only later on are we able to see the intervention of divine grace in those happenings, which at the time seemed to us to be the trials of life or even injustice. In any case, just one step away from his priestly ordination, after having lived in the friary for 13 years, Stefano left the Franciscan order and found himself alone, having to face life in the world without knowing what he would do, where he would live, or even how. Why did God permit this great initial trial in the life of this priest of his? Entering religious life as a child and then ending up a complete failure after the main period of formation is a terrible blow. But this is how God's instruments are forged. This is how great missionaries are prepared. It must be clear that it is the Holy Spirit who works and not human initiative. Quoting 1 Corinthians, "God chose the lowly and despised of the world, those who count for nothing, to reduce to nothing those who are something, so that no human might boast before God." And Stefano Gobbi was certainly reduced to nothing. This is the price that all those who receive great gifts for the common good must pay. The instrument must be pure. He mustn't boast about himself. He must have the continuous perception of his nothingness and of his failings. Therefore, it is clear that everything that happens comes from God. However, is it easy to live continuously with a sense of one's own failings? What great faith is needed. It is faith that makes a Christian truly grow, and from one act of faith to another, the heart opens up to sanctity. Padre Pio wasn't a saint because of the gift of his stigmata, but because he practiced virtues to a heroic degree. He was also forged by the events and difficulties of religious life, but he remained faithful. Indeed, he grew to great heights by obeying God no matter what. This is how young Stefano interpreted the harshness of his trial when he was with the Franciscans. He felt rejected both by God and by his beloved order in which he had been formed, but he understood that this was also the hour of his faith being tested. Acts 4:19, "It is better to obey God rather than men." He entrusted himself completely to the Virgin Mary and set out on the winding road that opened up before him, the uncertainty of not knowing what to do, where to go, how to live, and what such a failure in life really meant. In the hour of confusion, he finally surrendered himself completely into the hands of Our Lady, the one who was molding him for an unimaginable mission.